In this video, I'm going to get you ready for your pre-release and first few drafts of Murders at Karlov Manor, the newest expansion from Magic the Gathering. We're going to cover the mechanics, the top commons in each color, a quick guide for each of the 10 two-color archetypes, and finally the combat tricks to look out for when you're playing your matches. Let's start with the mechanics, and there are quite a few, so buckle in. First up is Disguise. This is a twist on the classic mechanic Morph that you may be familiar with and works much the same way with a few differences. You can cast a creature with Disguise face down for 3 generic mana, and it enters the battlefield as a 2/2 with Ward 2. Importantly, your opponent can't see its other side. And whenever you'd like, at instant speed, you can pay the Disguise cost to flip the creature over to its front half. Next up is Cloak. This is only present on a handful of rares and a single uncommon, so you won't run into it too often, but it's good to know. When you cloak a card, it simply means to put it face down as a 2/2 creature with Ward 2. Going forward, you may flip the card if it is a creature, again at instant speed. Just pay its normal casting cost to do so. Also, if it's a creature with Disguise, you may pay the Disguise cost, which might get you some additional benefits for paying that cost instead. If it's any other permanent type, you can't flip it. Next is Investigate, a returning mechanic. That simply means to create a clue token. This is an artifact that can be sacrificed at instant speed for 2 mana, allowing you to draw a card. There are a few cards that reward you for sacrificing artifacts, but otherwise pretty straightforward. Next up is Suspect. When a creature becomes suspect, it gains menace and can't block. This is a high-risk, high-reward, aggressive mechanic, mostly present on red and black cards. When you're the beatdown, you don't care that your creatures can't block, so giving them menace is a nice bonus. You could also suspect an opponent's stabilizing blocker to get it out of the way. Next is Collect Evidence. This is present on a bunch of cards as an alternate cost for certain effects or to power up effects. It simply means to exile cards from your graveyard with mana value equal to or greater than the Collect Evidence value. For example, the Forensic Researcher. To activate its second ability, you would need to exile cards with total mana value 3 or greater from your graveyard. And finally, we have Cases, a new enchantment subtype with some unique effects. First, they usually have an enters the battlefield effect you get right away. The next block of text describes how to solve the case, which always triggers at the beginning of your end step. For example, with Case of the Gorgon's Kiss. To solve it, 3 or more creatures had to be put into the graveyard from anywhere this turn. That could happen on the turn you cast it, or on some future turn. Then the last block of text describes what happens if you solved the case. In this example, Case of the Gorgon's Kiss becomes a 4/4 with Death Touch and Lifelink. Okay, now that we know what's going on with the mechanics, let's get into my picks for the top commons in each color. A quick note here is that this is a Ravnica set, so of course there are a lot of multicolor cards. There are 2 uncommons and a single common in each guild, and they all seem quite a bit better than the average monocolored card. Don't be afraid to try and carve out your lane and commit to a guild early. These rankings coming up are for the monocolored cards only, so bear that in mind. Let's start with white. And in at number 3, Makeshift Binding. A staple removal spell that also gains you some life to stabilize or extend the game. It also exiles the creature, unlike pacifism style effects, so your opponent cannot sacrifice the creature for value after you've locked it down. Fantastic, staple white common. In at number 2, Inside Source. 3 power and toughness for 3 mana with upside. It's a detective for that deck, has a relevant activated ability to impact the late game, and helps you go wide for the many decks that want to do so. This looks like a card that will hold together the synergies for a wide range of white decks. And number 1, an easy choice in my opinion, Novice Inspector. This is a functional reprint of Thraben Inspector, an all-time great white common. This creates a ton of value for just 1 mana, crack the clue to draw a card, or sacrifice it or the creature itself to other effects. There will be lots of uses for this fantastic common. Now let's move on to blue. And number 3, Dramatic Accusation. A solid blue removal spell. Without the ability to shuffle it into your opponent's library, it would just be fine, but having that option does a lot to prevent your opponent from trying to target it with a sacrifice effect or something else for value, since you could just shuffle it away in response. And in at number 2, Reasonable Doubt. This would be a pretty solid card if it just countered something unless your opponent paid 2, but the additional line of text should be quite good in more tempo-oriented decks, giving your own creatures menace to keep beating down, or removing a key blocker your opponent is trying to use to stabilize. And my pick for best blue common is Cold Case Cracker, a solid body that replaces itself when it dies. It's also a detective, which is relevant in this set. This is a solid creature you'll be happy to play in any blue deck and always does what it's supposed to do. Now let's move on to black. And number 3, Slice from the Shadows. 3 mana to kill a 2/2 or a 3/2 is pretty good, but it also has the added benefit of getting to scale with the late game. Flexibility is worth a lot in a Magic card. It also can't be countered for when that's relevant, but since it's an instant, you can also just use it to win a combat. Number 2, Macabre Reconstruction. At 4 mana, this is fine. At 2, this is incredible. Make sure you build your deck to make it good, with lots of self-mill and a solid density of creatures, but once you do, this will be a great card. And number 1, Murder. Kind of an obvious choice for the best black common. This is the only unconditional removal spell. Take these highly. Now let's move on to red, and in at number 3, Shock. Another reprint for Shock. It's always good, and it will be good again. Cheap interaction is hard to come by, plus this one can pick off your opponent's life total. You'll be happy having a few of these. Number 2, Person of Interest. For 4 mana, you get 4/4 worth of stats across 2 bodies, and half of it with Menace, since it comes into play Suspected. Besides being an excellent rate you'd be happy to play in any red deck, there are also ways to get value from the fact that your creature is a suspect, and going wide is a theme in multiple color pairs. Bread and butter red common. And number 1, Galvanize. 2 mana to deal 3 to any creature at instant speed is of course great, but you've got some upside to go with it. Take these highly. Finally, green, and in at number 3, Fanatical Strength. If this set is anything like recent ones, tempo will be extremely important and games will be relatively fast. These 2 mana green combat tricks have been very good lately. A well-placed combat trick will be devastating, and this one will help you win many games thanks to the trample. Number 2, Loxodon Eavesdropper. Think of it this way. It's a 6 mana 4/4 vigilance that lets you draw a card, but you can spread out the cost over 2 turns. A solid rate creature that replaces itself and provides some material for you to use in other ways. This should be solid in every green deck. And number 1, Bite Down on Crime, your go-to removal spell in green. It lets a creature really punch up since it gets +2/+0, and it's a bite, not a fight, so you can also attack after the spell resolves. Unfortunately, it is sorcery speed, but at either 2 or 4 mana, you'll be really happy to have 1 or 2 of these in your deck. Now, let's do a quick overview of the 10 2-color draft archetypes, starting with Blue-White Detectives, and its signpost uncommon, Private Eye. For 1 white-blue, we get a 3/3 Homunculus Detective. Other detectives you control get +1/+1, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked this turn. I'm excited to play with this deck. It's a deck built around the detective creature type, but it looks like it'll play out like an aggressive tempo deck with flyers like Market Watch Phantom, Perimeter Enforcer, and Cold Case Cracker, while keeping your opponent off balance with cards like Unauthorized Exit and Out Cold. Up next is Blue-Black Clues Control, and its signpost uncommon, Curious Cadaver. For 2 blue-black, we get a 3/1 Zombie Detective with flying. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, return Curious Cadaver from your graveyard to your hand. Draw out the game with counterspells and removal, then take over the late game by grinding out your opponent with cards from your leftover clue tokens, generated by other cards like Case of the Filched Falcon and Deduce. Next is Red-Black Suspect Aggro, with Runebrand Juggler as the signpost uncommon. For black-red, we get a 2/2 Human Shaman. When it enters the battlefield, suspect up to 1 target creature you control. Pay 3 black-red and sacrifice a suspected creature. Target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. This is an aggressive deck that wants you to suspect your own creatures to give them menace and beat down. Then other cards pay you off for having suspect creatures like Clandestine Meddler and Deadly Complication. Next up is red-green Big Disguise, and its signpost uncommon, Tin Street Gossip. For 2 red-green, we get a 4/4 Viashino Advisor with Vigilance. Tap to add red-green. We can only spend this mana to cast face-down spells or to turn creatures face-up. This deck wants to build its mana with cards like Tunnel Tipster and the Gossip, then use all that extra mana to flip your powerful disguise creatures like Riftburst Hellion and Culvert Ambusher. Next is green-white Go Wide Disguise with Sumala Sentry as its signpost uncommon. For green-white, we get a 1/3 Elf Archer with Reach. Whenever a face-down permanent you control is turned face-up, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and a +1/+1 counter on Sumala Sentry. Having a few copies of Inside Source will be essential to this deck, as it's the only way to generate multiple bodies in this color pair for cheap. Once you've built your board, use payoffs like Case of the Gateway Express and Greenbelt Radical to pump your team and get your opponent dead. Next is black-white Pint-Sized Disguise, and its signpost uncommon, Wisp Drinker Vampire. For 2 white-black, we get a 2/4 Vampire Rogue with flying. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. Pay 5 white black, creatures you control with power 2 or less gain death touch and lifelink until end of turn. Play cards that care about creatures with power 2 or less, like Neighborhood Guardian and Market Watch Phantom, then find ways to generate tokens like with Leering Onlooker and Inside Source. Next up is Blue-Red Artifact Sacrifice and its signpost uncommon, Gleaming Geardrake. For Blue-Red, we get a 1/1 artifact creature Drake. It has flying. When it enters the battlefield, investigate. And whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Gleaming Geardrake. Generate artifacts with cards like Harry Dronesmith and Case of the Filched Falcon. Then sacrifice those artifacts to other effects like Benthic Criminologist and demand answers. Next is Black-Green Gravebreak with its signpost uncommon, Insidious Roots. For Black-Green, we get an enchantment. Creature tokens you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, and whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. First, fill your graveyard with cards like Aftermath Analyst and Rubblebelt Maverick, then have creatures leave your graveyard with It Doesn't Add Up or Macabre Reconstruction, and collect evidence effects. Finally, get paid off for cards leaving your graveyard like with Chalk Outline and Soul Enervation. Next is Red-White Battalion and its signpost uncommon, Meddling Youths. For 3 red-white, we get a 4/5 Human Detective with haste. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, investigate. Go wide with cards like Dogwalker and Person of Interest, then get paid off for attacking with 3 or more creatures like Karlov Watchdog, or just pump the team with On the Job. Finally is Blue-Green Collect Evidence and its signpost uncommon, Evidence Examiner. For green-blue, we get a 2/2 Merfolk Detective. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may collect evidence 4. Whenever you collect evidence, investigate. Play other cards that trigger when you collect evidence, like Surveillance Monitor, and then ways to repeatedly collect evidence, like Sample Collector, alongside ways to fill your graveyard, like Aftermath Analyst. And finally, let's go over the common combat tricks you're going to see in your games. Knowing these spells can make or break games of Limited, so let's make sure you know what to look out for. I'm going to show you a mana cost, then you have to guess what card your opponent could be representing. Some of these you've seen already in the video, so feel free to pause if you want to challenge yourself. Here we go. 1 and a white. Auspicious Arrival. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Investigate. Blue. Behind the Mask. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you may collect evidence 6. Until end of turn, target artifact or creature becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/3. If evidence was collected, it has base power and toughness 1/1 until end of turn instead. Black. Toxin Analysis. Target creature gains death touch and lifelink until end of turn. Investigate. Red. Felonious Rage. Target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. When that creature dies this turn, create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. 1 and a green. Fanatical Strength. Target creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. And for a full list of all the instants in the set, I've provided a link to a Scryfall page down in the description. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to drop a like and consider subscribing for future draft strategy videos just like this one. I'll see you next time.